Hey there, I'm Dejan Isak, and this is the Agency Engine Room, where we cut through the noise of thousands of tools to reveal the systems that actually deliver client results. The agencies that scale aren't just using more tools. They're strategically integrating the right tools to create operational engines that consistently deliver without burning out their teams. Find show notes and resources at agencyengineroom.com or /agencyengineroom on LinkedIn. Today, we're opening the engine room with Marcel Petitpas, CEO and co-founder of Parakeeto. He's built what he calls the Swiss watch of agency data management systems that help agencies go from zero profitability to 27% net profit in under 60 days. Marcel, welcome to the Agency Engine Room. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at Parakeeto?
Thank you for having me, Dean. It's a pleasure to be here in the engine room. I help agencies measure and improve their profitability. That's what I've been solely focused on for the last almost 7 years now. And we do that with a combination of proprietary technology that we've built and a consulting service that we layer on top of that. So, we generally work with clients in a two-step process. We start by doing an assessment of their agency so we can really understand how profitable they should be, where they're leaving money on the table, and get really clear on what their priorities, objectives, targets, benchmarks are. And then most clients choose to work with us on an ongoing profit management plan where we then install the measurement and then coach them on the data to help them move the business in the right direction and improve their profits. So at a high level, that's what we do and how we work with firms.
Very cool. I know you've been traveling the podcast circuit a little bit recently. You were on the Handbook Operations podcast not too long ago. What's driving all this cool speaking activity right now?
6 years of just hammering away at thought leadership and getting on podcasts. And it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where it's like the more podcasts you get on, the more podcasts you get on. The same is kind of true about speaking. Once you sort of pierce the speaking bubble, you start to get asked to speak at more and more places. And so I think we've just been hammering on this for so long that there's enough momentum now that we don't really have to do a whole lot of pushing or outreach to get me on podcasts and stuff like that. Because I think, I'm finally at a place where people see me as somewhat of an expert and want to hear what I have to say.
Yeah, for sure. That's why I reached out, and that's why you're here after all. Let's dig a little bit into the details, because you've written that the agency world is changing, and you're saying you've done it for like 6 years already. Margins are getting tighter, the client demand is growing. Can you just help us connect what the industry shift is in regards to your mission and how you're turning agencies into a profitability machine?
So it's interesting because I think about this at a macro and a micro level. So at a macro level, I think the agency industry is just maturing as an industry in the way that every industry matures over time. And sort of the basic economic law, right, is that over time, the margins in any industry tend to get worse. And the reason for that is as that industry matures, there's more competition, that industry becomes more sophisticated, and generally you're going to see price pressure as these things become more and more commoditized over time. And I think that is happening in the agency industry. It started with advertising, back when everything was print and out of home and those kinds of things. Then, of course, it became more digital. And then we had this whole wave, really starting in like the mid 2000s of the digital first agencies. Now those two worlds have sort of converged. And, the long and short is just that the barriers to starting a firm have gotten lower and lower and lower every year. There's more and more competition. There's more and more people that are able to offer these services, in particular on the digital side. And so, that's just sort of a natural thing that's happening. However, I think the reason that this has started to feel very acute for firms is because there's been a couple of events over the last few years that feel like they've taken maybe a decade or two of maturity and crammed it into a couple of years. The first one was obviously the global pandemic, which had a couple of interesting effects. The first is that it massively increased the demand for especially digital services. There were a lot of traditional businesses that surprisingly had not really been embracing digital up until that point, and then they were forced to. So we had a lot of firms that had a great year for new business, or a great couple of years for new business when the pandemic broke out. But something was happening in that same time frame, which was we had an immediate globalization of services where all of a sudden everyone was working remotely, and there were still some geographical barriers at play, prior to the pandemic, and where those still existed, they very quickly eroded. Right. So all of a sudden, it like really didn't matter where the agency was located. And now all of a sudden, You look to Eastern Europe, you look to South America, you look to Southeast Asia. There's incredible talent, incredible agencies doing great work. And all of a sudden, brands that never would have considered those options are now looking at those options. And that starts to sort of flatten the world in a sense from a competition perspective. So you have price pressure coming from that side, while at the same time, you might recall the cost of onshore talent in North America shot up significantly. I remember seeing reports that, roles like engineers, project managers, account managers, creatives, they were getting 30 to 40% pay increases over the first couple years of the pandemic because demand for that talent was so high, demand for the services was so high. And at the same time, everybody was sort of going through an existential crisis and deciding that maybe they didn't want to work so much and have a more work-life balance and be closer to their family and all those things. So that was a massive accelerant. And then just as feels like the dust is starting to settle from those things, you have a really kind of interesting political climate. You have the bottoming out of software as a service now being replaced with AI in terms of where venture capital and risk capital is flowing. And you have this tidal wave of AI coming that really proposes to disrupt and commoditize a lot of the things that agencies have traditionally billed clients for. And so these are things that have really accelerated the commoditization and the pricing pressure and sort of the cost structure of the industry, but it's all happening very, very quickly. So now everyone feels like, oh shit, what's going on? What's happening to our margins? Even though I think if you zoom out far enough, you would see that, that was happening anyway. Like the industry was maturing, but these were very, very marked points in time where we felt it because it was happening much more quickly than it otherwise would.
Yeah, let's speak a bit about the margins. So you said that agencies measure a lot of things, but they don't really understand why they're measuring it or what they're actually looking at. Like, it's nice to have data, but what are you doing with the data if you don't know how to interpret it?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit what agency owners are actually looking at when they have this data set, but they don't know what to do with it?
Yeah, I mean, it runs the gamut. And of course, there's different areas of the business that firm owners are paying attention to. And I think a lot of it sort of depends on what their focus is. A lot of people will focus on sales and marketing metrics because their main focus is getting more clients. And of course, that is important, especially in the early days. That's sort of the first thing you have to do is figure out how to get someone to transact with you. But then what often gets ignored is the other side of that, which is, okay, a client has agreed to give us money to do this thing. But what is then not really being paid attention to is what does it cost us to do that thing? And is there enough money left over after the thing is done for us to be able to pay for our overhead and then have a sustainable business model and have profit to either reward founding team for the risk that they took or have some money to reinvest back in the business to support growth and infrastructure and all those kinds of things. And so that's a big thing. There's not enough focus often placed on the delivery side and the operations side of the business in terms of how to measure those metrics. And then in cases where there is a focus placed on those things, there tends to be a lot of confusion around how exactly to measure those things and around what good looks like. And I've seen it a million times where a firm will be struggling with profitability. They'll listen to a podcast like this. They'll get on Google. They'll figure out, oh, I need to be looking at utilization and average billable rate and my margin on projects. They sort of piecemeal a bunch of different metrics together that aren't even really consistent with one another conceptually. Then they'll start measuring things. 6 months go by. They go, okay, great. We have our utilization report for the last 2 months. Our utilization was X. And then all of a sudden they realize, well, is that good or is it bad? I don't actually know. What was I expecting it to be? And then they start looking at industry benchmarks, which is kind of a crapshoot in of itself, because if you ask 10 different agencies how they measure utilization, you'll get 10 different answers. And then you're trying to compare yourself to other firms, even though that's not really relevant to what your firm is doing in your unique context. And so that's a really big mistake that I think it's a trap that people fall into, which is jumping to trying to measure actuals as opposed to starting with what are our expectations about our business model. And that's, generally why we always start there with clients. And it's much quicker and it's much lower cost than trying to run forward to tracking all of these metrics without necessarily having an understanding of how you'll know if the result you get from tracking that metric is good or bad and what you'll do about it.
I'm actually quite surprised because I hear it a bunch of times that agencies are not even tracking the amount of time it takes them to deliver a service. Like you're writing a blog post and you just slap a number on it. Let's say it costs $500, but you're not checking, okay, does it take on average 6 hours to write a blog post? how much is the hourly rate for the freelancer? Are we actually making money on this blog post, or are we losing money?
Yeah, it's incredible how few firms are really doing that diligently. And it's also incredible how few firms are actually thinking deeply about that when they sell things. And I mean, time is often one of the things that's being used to set a price. But then the more important question, which is, what is the margin that you expect to make on this? And is that enough margin to support your business model? Almost no firm that I speak to has thought about that deeply or really considers that when they're selling things. And so it's unsurprising that a lot of them end up with indigestion problems in their business. You know, a lot of times it starts with what they're eating. In other words, what they're selling to clients is fundamentally setting themselves up for failure, but they're just not aware of it necessarily.
When agencies come to you, what's the most expensive operational mistake you are seeing that they're making, and it actually leads to really heavy profit loss?
So I think one of the most, and thankfully we don't see this too often, but I'll say there's two main mistakes, and I'll separate them into two categories. So I mentioned earlier, we always start with understanding the business model and what we expect from that business model when we work with clients before we go down the path of tracking time and, you know, trying to collect historical data to analyze what's really going on in the business. And the reason for that is we've run into a number of firms where they were working so hard and trying to do everything right, managing scopes of work and, you know, delivering things on time and really managing their costs and really managing their overhead. And yet they were always struggling with profitability. And then we would do an engagement with them and we'd build a model of their firm. And then we would realize in doing that model, like, hey, you know, Dean, you said you wanted to have a 20% net profit in your business. Turns out the way your business is designed, if everything goes perfectly, you'll only make 14%. So it's literally impossible for you to achieve your goals with the business that you have designed the way that you've designed it. And so that is really sort of punishing because there's no amount of execution that will fix that. That is a business model problem. We need to make changes to the fundamentals of the business, whether that's what you charge, how your team is structured, what your time off policies are. You know, like there's something fundamental that needs to change about that business so that your objectives can exist within the possibility of that business. And that's not subjective, it's just a big math equation. And it's really not that complicated of a math equation, to be honest. So we start there. So that's one of the biggest mistakes that I see some firms make is they set their business up for failure without really knowing it. And it's just because they've never really taken the time to sit down and work through the math of this many people getting paid this much money, working this many hours. You know, when we sell things for this much, like what does that actually add up to? And is it enough for us to get to where we want to go? So there's that. And then there's the other side, which is let's assume their business model is working correctly and they're still underperforming. There's two main reasons that firms will underperform. The first is that their utilization is not high enough. So their team theoretically could be doing, 10 projects a month, but they're only ever really getting them 6, right? So that's a very common problem, but that one is fairly simple and quick to solve for. Usually the fastest way to solve for that is, you right size the team to the amount of work that you're able to consistently bring in, right? So it's not easy, but it is simple. What is unfortunately more challenging is the other reason that people tend to underperform, which is their average billable rate is too low. Meaning for every hour of effort that they spend doing client work, regardless of how they've priced it or sold it, they're just not earning enough money. And that could be either because they're not charging enough for that work and or because they spend far too much time relative to what they've sold. And so that often traces back to a pricing and scoping issue where when they sold the thing, they're setting themselves up for failure. If you have a lot of recurring clients, it's actually quite a bit quicker and easier to solve for this, but it will often still take several months to start working this out. Where it's a little bit more challenging is if you're selling big projects that last 6 months, a year, 18 months, then really the life cycle of your project is the fastest timeline that you could expect to solve that problem on. So that could be a really challenging situation where it's like, even if we know that that's the problem and we fix it, you have to let all those projects play out. You have to let the new projects come in. It can take a long time to actually improve that problem.
Yeah, I can see how this is a really big problem for like boutique agencies that have like these super long periods of proposals and everything. And then you actually get started on work. Then there's like the scope creep that comes up after a few months. The client wants more and more stuff. So if you set up yourself for failure, basically, if all your pricing is wrong and it takes you way too long to deliver and you don't actually know how to calculate this properly.
Yeah, and there's two components to this. The first is understanding how much to charge. And there's quite a simple framework that we use for that. We like to focus on delivery margin when we sell anything. And so the way we define delivery margin is, we take what we're getting paid, we subtract pass-through expenses from that. So pass-through expenses would be things like advertising spend, print budgets, maybe third-party vendors, right? So it's money that you might collect from the client, but that isn't actually yours. So a good example of this would be if you run digital advertising or you run, I don't know, PPC campaigns for clients, they might give you $20,000 a month. But if you're giving $10,000 of that to Google for the PPC ads, well, that's not a $20,000 a month client. That's only a $10,000 a month client to you, the agency. Only 10,000 of that money is yours. And now you need to earn that $10,000 with your team's time. So that's the first thing we want to understand is of the revenue that we're collecting, how much of that is actually ours? We call that agency gross income. And then the second piece of that is what will we spend to earn that income? So for example, if I'm actually making $10,000 from this engagement and I spend $5,000 a month on the labor and the people to actually service that client and get things done, then I have a 50% delivery margin on that project. And the goal, every business is a little bit different, but the vast majority of firms that we work with, and without knowing more about the people that are listening to this, generally speaking, you want to have a delivery margin when you sell something of 70% or more. I know that sounds high, but when you consider that you have all kinds of indirect delivery costs that you need to account for, like the, SEO manager that's supporting the delivery team, but they're not really doing a whole lot of client work, all the tools that you pay for, all of the time off and unutilized time and gaps in client projects that are going to eat away at your margin, usually between 10 and 20% of that. Then you have overhead, which is often going to eat up another 30%. That leaves you with about 20%, again, if everything goes well and you keep your team really utilized. So 70% margin is generally what you want to aim for. And you can apply that to any pricing model, whether it's a monthly retainer, whether it's an hourly rate, a day rate, a week rate, a month rate, a whole project fee, whether you're doing a percent of ad spend. At the end of the day, all you need to be able to figure out is what is the agency gross income for this unit that I'm selling and what roughly will it cost me? And am I setting myself up for at least a 70% margin on that? And so that's something, you can kind of take to the bank, and it really simplifies the assessment of, is this price enough, regardless of how it's staffed, regardless of how much pass through there is, regardless of what the pricing model is.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about the implementation, because you mentioned that your work usually runs fine with existing tools. So you're not forcing agencies to replace everything. There doesn't have to be new time tracking tools, new client portals, and so on.
Yeah.
How does your Swiss watch approach, what you called it, actually connect the dots between all these tools?
Yeah, it's funny because we're just like bringing something that's actually really old and mature and not that fancy to a market that's never done it before. The simplest way to talk about what we do is we build data pipelines for small businesses. And a data pipeline is essentially, if you went to any large enterprise company, they would have a team called a data operations team. They might call it something different. And that team would be made up of some data engineers, some data scientists. They would have really expensive enterprise tools that they pay a few $100,000 a year for. And what that team does all day long, every day for the whole year, is they go and they pull data from all the different places that it's being created in the business, the CRM, the ERP, the bazillion tools that their teams are using. And then they build data pipelines, which is essentially you extract information from those source tools, you load it into an environment where you can then do all the things that you need to do to get data to be clean and reliable. So you could stitch it together, where you take time tracking data and you combine it with your project management data. You stitch those data sets together. You normalize data, right? So we used to have this naming convention 6 months ago. Then when we hired a new project manager and they wanted to change how we used ClickUp, we changed the naming convention and we changed the structure. Okay, well, let's normalize those things. So this variant of design is actually the same as this new variant of design. Let's write a rule that normalizes those things together. We can do quality assurance, right? So run some scripts that say, hey, look for time entries that are longer than 8 hours so that we can catch if, Dean was on holiday and he forgot his timer was running and logged a 36-hour time entry. Well, is that a mistake? Probably. Look for time that was logged to projects that were done more than a month ago. Look for time entries where people log time to the wrong task category, where engineers log time to design. Is that real? Is that a mistake? Right? So all kinds of quality assurance things. You can do transformations to the data, like all of the kinds of things that you just sort of need to do to most data sets, especially human created data sets, in order to get to reliable, accurate reporting. And then we do a whole bunch of computation and calculations to look at things like utilization, project profitability, et cetera. And then we load that into a visualization layer. In most cases, it's reports that we've built because most clients don't have, a visualization layer that they're using. And that's essentially what we're doing. And we've just built a bunch of our own technology to help us do that for smaller firms in a way that is sort of multi-tenant and portable. But we're really just taking the best practices from companies that have had to deal with big data for a long time, and we're bringing them down market because my insight is small businesses now have big data, but we don't have any of the tools, any of the best practices, any of the knowledge, or really the budget or the skill set on the team to manage that data in a best practice way. And what that sort of often leaves people trying to do is trying to get their source data to be the source of truth, trying to do their reporting inside of tools like Harvest and ClickUp and et cetera. And of course, they're not getting good outcomes because that's just fundamentally not a good way to manage data in any organization. But that's sort of a new problem for us. It's never been cheaper or easier to produce all of this data before. And so we're sort of all trying to figure out how to deal with it.
Yeah, I'm wondering, how much do you think is like the user error impacting agencies? Because you say you run scripts just to check, okay, was the time entry wrong? Humans make mistakes,
Yeah,
but most people will not catch those mistakes because it's very hard to go through the data set.
exactly. Yeah, and I think this is a huge problem because the old adage is garbage in, garbage out, and I don't like that framing because it frames the problem as an input problem. It sort of frames the problem as we need to stop garbage from coming into the system. But the reality is garbage is coming into the system no matter how badly you try to fight it. And there's actually this really diabolical tension. And anybody that's tried to do a large scale implementation of any kind of tool to their broader, employee base, time tracking is a perfect example of this. The harder you try to limit the variance on input and lock down, like, oh, you have to pick a specific project, and the more complexity you add to that, the lower your compliance gets. So great, you might get every time entry being perfect, but then your team's only putting 30% of their time into the system. So you're losing either way. So the answer from my perspective is don't try to get the data coming in perfectly. It's never going to work, ever. And that problem is only going to get worse the bigger your team gets. The answer is give yourself some tools to be able to still get a good outcome, even if there's going to be mistakes, right? So from like an architecture perspective, I think designing a system that only works if the data coming in is perfect is so naive because that's just never going to be the case. And this is the reason that I think the promise of a ERP or a PSA, right? 20 years ago when Salesforce was saying, oh yeah, push all of your stuff into the CRM and it'll become the source of truth. There's a reason no sophisticated data team is architecting their systems that way anymore because they know it doesn't work. And the same thing, I think, needs to start to get adopted in smaller businesses where it's like the idea that you're going to have your team perfectly input their data into all these systems so you can just like Zapier it into a dashboard. Or if you're going to use an all-in-one platform and then just be able to like click a button and run a report, it's just not really feasible. And so, yes, user error is a thing and it is a challenge. But the thing that I would ask and encourage people to reframe is the problem isn't that there's going to be mistakes made. The problem is that we are setting ourselves up for failure by trying to build a system that doesn't work if that happens, knowing that it's just going to happen, right? It's part of the process.
Let's move to the user impact section because I'm wondering, when agency teams have now access to better data, how does it scale differently across different departments inside an agency? Like what do different teams see?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The first place that we start, of course, is at the leadership level. And, to take a step back, we talk a lot about data and reporting, and, that's what we talk to a lot of potential clients about. It's where the focus of the conversation is. But the reality is what we're really selling is alignment and execution, right? That's actually the purpose of the data. The data itself is not useful. And there's an internal saying that we have, which is the data can only tell you what the data is. It can't tell you why the data is. And at the end of the day, the value of that data is measured in the degree to which it can help you make decisions faster and more accurately, and then take action on those things. So the thing that we're trying to do with leadership teams to start off with is take them from where they often are when they come to see us, which is spending most of their time in meetings, sort of arguing about what they think is happening and what they think they should be doing, and trying to build some kind of consensus in a largely subjective conversation, which is very exhausting and unproductive, and move them to a place where they're all sitting on the same side of the table, looking at what they see as a set of facts that they can all understand. This is the data. This is what's happening in the business. It's clear that our focus needs to be here. Now, as a team, let's talk about what we think we can do and what the next steps are to move that in the right direction. And our job is to really facilitate that conversation. So hopefully they leave that meeting with a sense of alignment, a sense of confidence that their thesis is valid and correct, so they can actually just go and do the things they need to do to make the business better. So generally, the three steps that we're going through at the leadership level is we start by looking at the model. What are we expecting to see? We look at the forecast. Are we on track to accomplish these things? And then we look at actuals and say, okay, where are the gaps between what we expected and what happened? And why did those gaps exist? Is it, and it pretty much always comes down to one of three things. Is it that our overhead was higher than it should have been? That's very rare, but sometimes it happens. Is it that our utilization was lower than we expected it to be? Or is it that our average billable rate was lower than we expected it to be? And then we can double click on each of those things and say, okay, which people or teams were underutilized, which projects or clients were, less profitable than expected. And we can get really, really pointed about, okay, where do we need to go and investigate or make adjustments next? That's really the objective at the leadership level. And then that starts to trickle down to the broader team. Generally, the middle or delivery management, if it exists in an organization, they're paying attention to average billable rate and utilization. Those are sort of their two biggest levers. And then the metric that will often make its way down to the broader team is average billable rate. We generally don't encourage people to expose utilization to their broader team, at least not early in the process. And if they are going to do that, we always want to have that counterbalanced with average billable rate. If we're going to expose one metric and over-index on one metric to the broader team, it's average billable rate, where we're going to look at, hey, how much time really did we expect to spend on this thing versus how much time actually went in? And then the conversation is just as focused on the positive outliers as the negative outliers. So, hey, here's a project where we were way more efficient. We spent way less time than expected, and the client was thrilled. That's great. What can we learn from this? What did we do differently? Is there anything we can apply to other projects? And similarly, the ones that didn't go as planned, what can we learn from this? What did we miss? What might we need to adjust next time? With the goal being that our expectations and reality end up getting tighter and tighter over time, so that the team isn't overworked, so that, we're not asking them to work evenings and weekends because we didn't foresee how long it was actually going to take to do things, so that we're financially sustainable, etc.
Yeah, I'm actually wondering about the leadership team, because in a different episode, my guest mentioned that there's a little bit of a disconnect between the leadership team and everyone below, because they just want to scale, for example, or increase profit, but nobody really knows why and how they're going to use that money, let's say, to reinvest. After implementing all these data points, do you see that they actually have better reasoning or better points to actually use the data to grow the agency, or just improve the utilization rate, or just reduce the time spent on tasks?
I mean, that is really where the conversation should start before we even get to the point of measuring all of these things, right? That comes back to the first conversation we have around the model, which is, what are your expectations from this business? What are your objectives? What is the sort of net profit that you want to accomplish, or maybe the growth rate that you want to accomplish, and how much margin is needed to get to that place, and why? So we should really have a foundation of reasoning going into this whole exercise. And then the next step is to say, is the business model capable of this? If not, what changes might need to be made in order to get there? And we're always doing that with a realistic understanding of what the team is actually capable of, right? So what we are definitely not doing is saying, oh, the industry benchmark is 75% utilization for this role. So let's just apply that to all of your, designers and team members without actually going through each individual person. This is what we actually do. We go through each individual person. We say, what is this person's job? What responsibilities do they have outside of just doing client work? What kind of internal meetings are they in? Are they taking care of the company website? Are they taking care of any other internal initiatives? And let's actually adjust our entire utilization expectation across the whole business based on what each individual person's job description is. And let's maintain that over time. And then that becomes a constraint, right? Now, unfortunately, there are management teams out there that will knowingly and explicitly run their business in such a way that they're effectively asking their team to subsidize underpricing or poor management. So expecting that people will work 60, 70, 80 hours a week to make up for the fact that they have not actually designed the business to be profitable or sold projects in a way that's profitable. That's not generally something that we are going to be very receptive to or encourage with our clients. And I don't think we've ever had an instance where we set up a business model with that kind of crazy expectation in mind. We're generally going to optimize this for what is an ideal, realistic scenario that doesn't breach the employment contract that you have with your team, and design the business to be successful within that constraint. And then the management team, it's really at their discretion if they want to invest a bunch of that profit back into the business, if they want to pull it out, right? But as long as the team is, being paid well, is working a reasonable amount of hours, is protected from being, overworked or at the whim of sudden layoffs because their margins were so thin that they couldn't afford any mistakes, then in my mind, everyone in that equation is winning, and the leadership team is empowered to make decisions from a place of financial security, which is generally a better place for human beings to be making decisions.
I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of your work. When you audit an agency's current setup, what kind of signs do you see that their tools are really fighting against each other instead of working together?
The first thing is that there are inconsistent concepts from one tool to another. And this one is nuanced, and it took us a very long time to figure this out in a way that worked for many different agencies. And it's one of the most common problems that we see with firms when we start working with them is when they start thinking about, what is the profit margin on a project? What is the profit margin that we expect to see on our profit and loss statement? What is the difference between our kind of bottom line profit and maybe our, what you might call gross margin or delivery margin or contribution margin? What is our utilization? What are our rates? How do we think about pricing? Right? All of these things are interconnected. And very quickly, I'll start to spot hey, your definition for a billable hour is different over here than it is over there. Or the way that you're saying you want to measure utilization over here is not actually how it's configured in this other tool, or the way a billable hour is defined in this other tool. So you start to see conceptual inconsistency between the tools. That's one of the biggest signs. And then the second one is sort of workflow related, where you just start to see that the way that these tools are working and the way that the team has to use these tools is not actually helping them get their job done. It's sort of getting in the way of them getting their job done. And the reason that this tends to happen is often because the implementation is trying to solve two somewhat distinct problems at the same time. The first is workflow, right? So how do these tools support us in actually getting the work done that we need to get done? And the other one is reporting. And oftentimes the sort of fool's errand here is I'm trying to set this up so that I can get all of the reporting that I need out of the tools themselves. When, in my opinion, and if you look at the best practices in larger businesses and how we implement these things in companies, generally you should just set this up in a way that you expect to extract data from those tools and run it through a proper data management and reporting process. And in doing that, what you often do is you create a lot more flexibility for the team to just use the tools in a way that actually works well for them without having to compromise on your ability to get the insight that you want. And what that tends to also do is increase your compliance. So because the team feels like, hey, this workflow actually makes sense, it's conducive to the way that I work, it flows with the way that I work, you're probably going to get them using the tools more, putting the data in more, having the cleanliness and quality of that data be higher. So it's this counterintuitive thing, but it's almost like the less you try to constrain those tools to producing reports at the source, likely the more successful you'll actually do in getting the right data out of those tools and being able to get the insight that you want.
Yeah, I'm wondering, besides the data going out of the tools, do you also see a problem where it's like the agency decides on one time tracking tool and then everyone in the agency has to use it because they're paying for it, right? But maybe it's not the best one for each specific group within the agency.
The reality is most people just don't like tracking time in the first place. So the tool is often not necessarily the problem, but certainly we see these instances where, again, often because there's some arbitrary constraint that's placed on an integration or on some kind of reporting or on a specific feature that somebody wants, that they impose a time tracking tool on the team that, again, is not ideal from a workflow perspective. And again, the ironic part of that, to your point, is it's not really working well for most of the people on the team. Therefore, the data coming into it is bad. And so, the outcome is still not being realized. And, it's also true that for a lot of companies, there's this obsession with trying to reduce the number of tools that are being used. So the idea that like two teams might use different time tracking tools is completely unfathomable to that company. But again, when you build a data pipeline, that becomes far less problematic. It's not ideal, obviously, but you can handle that. We've worked with clients that had different project management and time tracking tools for different parts of their company. For example, the engineering team is using Jira and Tempo. The design team is using Asana and Harvest. And guess what? As long as we can go in and pull that data out and write a logic statement that says, okay, these objects in Harvest correspond to these objects in Jira. Let's stitch those data sets together. Let's normalize them. Then we can end up with a set of timesheets that looks at the entire organization in a consistent way, right? There's an additional step there, but that's the magic of setting your systems up and reporting in this way, that you have tools to be able to, even if there's different tools being used, even if those tools are changing over time, still end up with clean data. So yes, we do see that. And again, it sort of comes back to trying to solve two sort of problems that are in tension with one another, and often trying to oversolve for reporting in those tools natively and ignoring workflow, as opposed to the other way around, which is generally what we would recommend. Focus on workflow first and then solve for reporting in a way that is more conducive to solving for reporting.
Looking at the success patterns across the agencies you've helped so far, what kind of operational principles do you see work regardless of the size of the agency or the speciality?
There's a number of principles, and some of these are going to be specific to reporting, and some of them are going to be a little bit more abstract. But one of the important principles is not conflating precision and accuracy. This is a really big one, especially when it comes to designing reporting systems, but you could apply this to a lot of different operational tasks or a lot of operational challenges in the business. So accuracy and precision are both relative concepts. A lot of people conflate them as being the same, but they're not the same. And in a lot of cases, actually, they're in tension with one another. So I'll give you an example of this tension. Let's say that you have this objective of saying, we want to understand the profitability of each client that we work with. So in order to accurately answer that question, really what you need to understand is how much money did we make on each client? What did we spend on each client? And what was the profit margin? And likely you're going to figure out how much you spent by taking the time that was spent on that client and multiplying it by some kind of average rate, or maybe even a specific rate per person based on the hours that were tracked. So when you think about a time tracking implementation, what are the requirements? On a time entry, you need to understand what client the time was worked against, who logged that time, how much time it was, and what day that happened on. 4 objects. Conversely, you might have a project manager in that organization that goes to implement the time tracking system, and they want to make it really, really precise. So they're going to say, I want to know how much time was tracked on the subtask, within the milestone, within the deliverable, within the phase, right? So that's a very precise data set. But what ultimately ends up happening is you might end up with a timesheet that's so noisy and so messy that you actually have to do a lot of extra work to clean all of that up and snap it back to how much time have we spent on this client, right? That precision might actually get in the way of getting an accurate answer to the question that you set out to answer. And it's likely going to mean that your data is worse because there's 15 different decisions I have to make every time I log a time entry. So I'm likely not going to get all of my time in, or I'm just going to start putting it in random places. And so that's like a one simple example of how precision and accuracy are, in that case, inversely correlated. The more precise we try to get, the less accurate the answer to that question becomes. And so managing this tension is one of the biggest traps that we see firms fall into when they're trying to install reporting systems, is they tend to over-index on precision and set themselves up for a system that theoretically would be great, but in practice is really not feasible for them to run. And that's true about reporting. But again, I think that idea applies to a lot of different things in the business as it relates to operations that eventually erode profitability because they're just not practical.
Yeah, I wonder where this comes from, because I used to be a freelancer and I did exactly this at some point, where I was like tracking meticulously every little task. And at some point I was like, I think I forgot to track one little task. And then you're like, okay, it doesn't make sense. You start forgetting to track little subtasks, and then you don't know how long it takes you to deliver the full project. Might as well just do like one long time tracking thing.
Yeah.
And just have an accurate data set, not super to the millisecond accurate.
I think my thesis on where this comes from is, in my observation, in a lot of boutique firms, most of the operations leadership is being recruited or upskilled from the project management function in the business, which makes a lot of sense, right? There are so many skills that you develop as a project manager that are going to be very, very accretive when you move into an operations role. However, there is a significant shift that happens that is hard for a lot of project managers to go through, which is, as a project manager, you're valued for your level of precision, and you're often rewarded for being highly precise. That job in the day-to-day management of projects rewards a focus on precision. And then when you become an operations leader, you have to sort of flip your way of thinking and be able to abstract away from that precision. And you also need to start to be able to find the middle ground between executive leadership and the way that they're thinking, which is often, their job is to make decisions with a lot of imperfect information and a lot of variability and a lot of uncertainty, which is quite different than your job as a project manager, which is often trying to make decisions with quite a lot more data and certainty and precision. So there's a shift that tends to happen. And so I think that's a big part of the reason that we fall into that trap, because when you were the senior project manager and then you're sort of said, like voluntold, like, hey, you're in charge of ops now. And you just say, okay, let me just like apply all the things I was doing as a project manager to ops and I'll be successful. That skill set can become an Achilles heel when you need to start abstracting that way of thinking and think more about like what is operationally feasible and what is actually the minimum effective dose to get the outcome that we need, especially at this sort of more executive level of thinking, which requires a lot of abstraction.
So you mentioned the skills. I'm actually very curious, since the margins are getting tighter and client demands increase. What kind of operational skills do you think will matter most for agencies that want to thrive in 2026?
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the trends that I'm seeing in the data, this is just like in doing audits, we pay attention to clients where we're like, oh, wow, they're sort of doing really well. They're really profitable. And we've noticed a couple of patterns. So one of the patterns, and this should be unsurprising to people because we've been talking about this ad nauseum for like a decade and a half in our industry, but it's the importance of this is not going down. In fact, it's increasing, is specialization, right? So firms that are specialized tend to be more profitable. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that. The first one is obviously they can charge more. The second is they tend to be able to define their process a little bit better. And the dynamic with the client is inherently less about taking orders and more about dictating, here is the process that we will use to solve your problem because we are the experts and we've done it before. And we have case studies that show you that we've done this before. So you could just trust us and we'll tell you how this is going to work. So there's a ton of downstream efficiencies that can be gained from that. You don't have to deal with scope creep and all of these things to the same degree that other firms that are not in that position and they're selling deliverables might be beholden to. So it's easy to underestimate just how significant that part of it is beyond just the fact that you can often charge a little bit more. But then within that, you look at the composition of the team. So that's external specialization, right? We know that that's great. Then you look at internal specialization. And this is about having the discipline to look at your skill set as a business and then say, okay, what are we going to focus on hiring and building as business functions internally versus what are we going to focus on hiring and building as business functions externally? And so a perfect example is like a very, very profitable firm that we worked with sold SEO services. And they were very specialized. They had a very specific market that they went after. They charged premium prices. That was all great. But when they looked internally at their skill set, they recognized, hey, we are a sales, marketing, and account management kind of strategy organization. That is our skill set. So they had account managers, a sales team, and some strategists on the team. They had one web developer in case, a client's website went up in flames in the middle of the night. Everything else, they pushed outside of their four walls. So the content, the link building, the technical SEO, like all of that very hard and often undervalued work and risky work, like the place where all the scope creep tends to happen, they found white label partners that were really good at operations and they were wildly profitable and they scaled extremely fast because they didn't have this operational drag of trying to play a game inside their four walls that they just actually didn't enjoy and did not come naturally to them. And similarly, those white label agencies knew that they were not sales and marketing and account management, client relationship organizations, but they were really good at that stuff and they were really good at operations and they were highly efficient, right? And so that marriage made a lot of sense in the same way that like when you book a flight with an airline, they don't do the food, right? They're not in the food business, they're in the airline business. So they have a third party that takes care of all the food for them. So I think going forward, we talked about maturity at the top of the episode. The industry is maturing. When you look at these very mature industries like grocery, like travel and logistics and transportation, they all have this commonality where the more mature that industry becomes, the more fragmented the supply chain becomes. Because in order to carve out enough margin to survive, you not only need to specialize externally, you have to become operationally specialized. So I think that that's a trend that we're going to see emerge over the next decade that's going to layer on top of what is now table stakes, in my opinion, which is you need to have external specialization, meaning be really clear about who you sell to, what problem you solve for them. And then the step two will be, that's actually not enough. Now you also need to look inside and specialize in terms of like, what are our skill sets as a business that we're going to build in-house and where are we going to partner and build a network of external vendors to really complete the operations of the business.
For our practical takeaways, for those listening right now and seeing that they actually are tracking way too many things and have no clue what they're looking at, can you give me like 3 operational changes they could implement this week that make an impact?
Yeah. So I would say the first thing is start calculating your delivery margin on everything that you sell starting today. And if you'd like some resources on that, I'm happy to send some. If you want to include them in the show notes, we have some blog posts and some calculators and some videos that talk through how to think about pricing and how to do that calculation. So that would be the first practical takeaway. If there's nothing else that you take away from this, please let it be that. The second thing that I would encourage you to do is, this is a shameless plug, but check out our free agency profit toolkit. And there are videos in there that will share the framework that we've developed for measuring your agency. So it'll walk you through exactly what you should be looking for when you get your financial statements every month from your accountant. And it'll walk you through the 3 simple numbers that you can use on a day-to-day basis to know if you're on track to be profitable or not before you even get your financials from your accountant. And that simple set of numbers, there's like 3 numbers on the finance side, 3 numbers on the ops side. That should be the 20% of information that you need to see 80% of what you need to see to run the business profitably. So those would be my sort of practical takeaways for today.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask the question I ask all of our guests. What's one underrated system, tool, or process that you believe is the hidden engine of growth for agencies today?
This is probably not going to be surprising. Over the last several years, but really over the last decade, again, during the pandemic, this really kind of exploded. We started really looking at global talent, especially in North America. And we were sort of forced into that because it's like we're now competing with agencies all over the world that have a massive advantage from a cost perspective. And so it became really interesting. You saw a lot of big firms say like, hey, there's this incredible talent pool in all of these different places that is significantly less expensive than the talent pool that we have onshore. Let's start tapping into that. And today, we've just discovered this country that has an unlimited amount of extremely low cost labor, and it doesn't ask for time off. It doesn't need food, water. It doesn't take breaks. It's called artificial intelligence. I hate to be the person that's just like talking about AI because everybody's friggin' talking about AI and I'm so sick of it. But like, how can you not? It is the most significant opportunity for firms that has ever existed. And it has this feature as well as a bug of if you're not on the right side of it, you're going to be for sure on the wrong side of it. And so that's sort of, I heard somebody frame this in this way of saying like, this is basically like discovering an unlimitedly deep talent pool that is like a fraction of the cost of anything else. And that's actually quite competent and that's learning faster than anyone and has perfect memory. And when you teach it something, it learns it the first time. It's really crazy. And so if you look at it through that lens, that is for sure, that has to be the most untapped path to growth across every vector of the business, whether it's sales and marketing, whether it's delivery and operations, whether it's, finding proprietary intellectual property that allows you to solve things in ways that nobody else is doing. That has to be the first place to look from my perspective. And it is scary. It is alarming how fast it's moving. It's exciting.
That is true. I use AI quite a lot myself, and lots of stuff for this podcast sponsored by AI because you can do a lot of research way faster than I would do it myself. So embrace it and use it where it makes sense. Like, don't go crazy trying to use AI where it doesn't make sense yet.
Totally. But it can like give you superpowers, right? And create a ton of leverage. And I've been trying to like really be on top of my team to spend the extra time to like, yeah, I know it's going to take you an extra hour right now, but like try to do this with AI. Try to use AI to make this a little bit quicker. And those being maniacal and being like really, really fanatical about that with the team is worth it. And we're already starting to see, the team is really starting to embrace that at Parakeeto. I'm really happy and excited to see it. And we've found some really great opportunities to not only get more efficient at what we do, but actually make it better for clients. I think ultimately like that's the goal, is to deliver the same or better quality and a better experience with lower cost. It doesn't get any better than that.
That is correct. Marcel, thanks for breaking down the systems behind the profitability machine you have engineered. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your approach?
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Dean. I really had a good time today. If people want to reach out, find me on LinkedIn, Marcel Petitpas on LinkedIn. I'm very active there. I like to post a lot, and I'm very active in the DMs as well. So if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me there. If you want to learn more about what we do at Parakeeto, you can head to parakeeto.com, where we have a ton of free resources, podcasts, blog posts, calculators, and of course, our free toolkit, all designed to help you get a better grip on your profitability at no cost. So be sure to go and check that out.
That's episode 8 with Marcel, wrapping up season 1 of the Agency Engine Room. We've broken down the operational systems behind successful agencies, the workflows, frameworks, and blueprints that actually work. We're taking a brief operational pause to build season 2, which is already in development with agency operators, SaaS founders, and industry experts who've cracked the scaling code. Visit agencyengineroom.com for show resource. We'll be back with season 2 in a few months.